role of scientific research and other kinds of research in the Sustainable Development Challenge. First, let me define the term sustainable development. It means combining economic development with social justice and environmental sustainability. So the basic idea of sustainable development is to meet three objectives of society: economic, social, and environmental objectives. This is the world's agreed framework under the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. All UN member states adopted the framework of sustainable development in those two agreements reached in 2015. The reason why sustainable development has become a framework for the UN is a crisis. The crisis is that the world economy does not produce economic, social, and environmental objectives in a holistic manner. The world economy is rather effective at producing economic growth, but it is rather ineffective at producing social justice, and it is disastrously contrary to environmental sustainability. So we have a world economic system that grows, but grows unequally and unsustainably. The idea of sustainable development and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement is to achieve economic growth that is also socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. That obviously requires a change of public policies, but it also requires a change of technologies. And it must be guided by basic science, because we need the science to make evident what are the environmental constraints, what are the major environmental crises that need solution, what kinds of solutions are necessary. And without the science, we're completely lost. We wouldn't even know that the planet is warming, and we certainly would not understand the climatology and the dimensions of the challenge. We'd have no idea how to map a pathway towards safety. So the world governments have agreed on sustainable development, but they did not agree on a plan of action. They don't have plans of action by and large. And the agreements were reached among diplomats, not among scientists, engineers, financiers, and policy experts. They were agreed at an aspirational level, not at a practical operational level. And this is a very big challenge, because our knowledge systems in the world that could mobilize the knowledge needed to achieve the goals that we've set are not well organized right now to direct our knowledge towards policy solutions. And our governments are generally not so interested in science. They're not very knowledgeable about science. They are not very knowledgeable about engineering and technology. And so we're in the hands of politicians generally who are very naive about these very questions. And the scientific knowledge is not brought to bear to answer these questions adequately. I think the most obvious case of this is the Paris Climate Agreement, where the governments agreed to keep the Earth's warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to aim to keep the warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This was an agreement reached in December 2015, by diplomats who had no idea at all of how those objectives could be achieved. And the governments that signed this agreement have no plans to achieve these objectives. And under the Paris Climate Agreement, each government puts forward a nationally determined contribution, so-called, but we know that those do not add up to sufficiency to achieve the goals that have been set. And this is the prototypical challenge we face throughout the global agenda, that we have a disconnect between aspirations and needs on the one side and the knowledge community, as well as the economic and financial community, to actually achieve the objectives. When it comes to the Paris Climate Agreement objectives, what we know now from the IPCC process is that in order to keep warming below 1.5 degrees C, we should decarbonize the energy system worldwide by 2050. This is the clear message of the IPCC 1.5 degree report. We also know from the underlying climate science that even 1.5 degrees C is very dangerous. It is certainly a temperature high enough to lead to the disintegration of the ice sheets. This is based on the record from the previous interglacial period, the Eemian, during which the sea level was 8 meters higher than it is today, at temperatures somewhere between what we have today and 1.5 degrees C. So the climatology tells us we're in a very dangerous world. The climatology tells us that we need to reduce emissions to zero by mid-century. And then we need the engineers to tell us how that can be done. And indeed, the pathways for deep decarbonization are now being elaborated by engineering experts. They show the basic framework, which is, to put it very simply, 100% power generation from zero carbon sources such as wind, solar, hydro, and so on. Electrification of transport and the use of synthetic fuels such as synthetic methane or synthetic hydrocarbons made using zero carbon electricity. So the technology roadmap is coming into view. The scientific necessity is better understood, and the policy community is completely confused because the politicians are generally uninterested in this issue, even though it is an existential issue for humanity. And especially in countries like my own, the United States, with lots of fossil fuels, our political system has been so corrupted by the fossil fuels that the politicians don't even consider the path to deep decarbonization because of the interests of the oil industry. This is a generic issue. Let me say from a knowledge point of view what we face here. First, we have the basic science. Then we have the engineering. Engineers are vital to this story in every way because the climatologists can tell us what we need to do and what the risks are if we don't do it, but they are not energy sector specialists. We need the engineers to point out the roadmaps to deep decarbonization. The engineers, however, are not policy experts, so they cannot by themselves design a policy framework, for example, carbon pricing or a renewable energy strategy for the utility sector in order to achieve the engineering design. And then finally, there are the politicians and the public, which don't understand the technical side of these issues, may or may not be corrupted by the incumbent industries, and in general, don't understand what needs to be done. So my view and experience is that we face a kind of value chain of integrated knowledge that includes three kinds of sciences, if you'll permit me to say that. One is the basic sciences, physics, earth sciences, chemistry, and so forth, on which we build everything. The second is the engineering sciences, which is absolutely vital for redesigning our physical infrastructure and our industrial sector. And the third is the policy sciences, which is my area. I admit that calling it science rather than science fiction or science rather than art is maybe an exaggeration. But we need all three of these disciplinary approaches: the basic sciences, the engineering, and the policy sciences, working in an integrated manner. I directed the Earth Institute at Columbia University for 14 years with exactly that premise in mind, that the Institute is based on science, it depends on the engineers, it has some economists, but the success of the mission depends on an integration across science, engineering, and public policy. In academia, this is not so easily achieved because each of these disciplinary bases has their own faculties, their own research agendas, their own financing streams. And so getting the integrated strategies are not simple to do. But I can tell you, certainly, our governments are completely incapable of doing it. So if we don't have our knowledge institutions working on this, they could be, of course, national laboratories and national research centers, but we can't expect presidents, prime ministers, and cabinets to work out these answers because they involve an integration of technical knowledge that cannot be found within the cabinet ministries themselves. They depend on the deep knowledge of the scientific and engineering communities. Deep decarbonization is one of several challenges of sustainable development. I would list 6 big challenges just to close. The first of the challenges is to decarbonize the energy system by mid-century. The second big challenge is sustainable land use and food production. Very relevant for Brazil, for example, because the way our global food system is working is that it is progressively encroaching on the small amount of remaining wilderness, for example, the Amazon, and it is going to destroy biodiversity if we don't have a more scientific approach to sustainable land use. So we need, country by country and at a global scale, a science-based conservation science that identifies properly the scale of land and the patterns of land that need to be set aside and kept outside of the economic sphere. And obviously, this is politically difficult, but it's also scientifically difficult. The third major area of research is health and well-being, because we have epidemics of communicable and non-communicable diseases that we want to get under control. And once again, to understand how to control malaria or AIDS or TB or metabolic diseases like adult onset diabetes require an integration of basic physiology and pathology with public health and with public policy. So again, it's a kind of science, engineering, and policy integration which needs to be brought to bear to solve these epidemics. The fourth area that I would mention is the education sphere. virtually every country is failing to educate its young people adequately for the 21st century. Again, this is a matter of educational design, delivery, training of teachers, and this I would put as a fourth agenda item. A fifth agenda item is sustainable urbanization. Right now, about 55% of the world's population is in cities. In Latin America, it's about 80% actually. In Africa, about 35%. We know that urbanization is proceeding with extraordinary speed, and we will have 70% of the world in urban areas by mid-century. Roughly another 2.5 billion people joining the cities by mid-century. Our cities are not equipped in terms of infrastructure, service delivery, smart grid, and so forth to give good lives to the people living in the cities. And urban science and urban design is therefore critical. There's a lot of good information technology that can be brought to bear in urban design. The sixth area is indeed the information technologies, the digital age that we're living in. As we all know, we are living in a revolution of tremendous promise in computation, in transmission of data. We'll now have 5G systems coming very shortly, in smart grids, in the Internet of Things. But we don't yet know how to govern these institutions properly. We don't know how to govern Facebook or Google or the other tech giants. We don't know how to preserve freedom and privacy in these systems. So this is a huge policy challenge because technology has run way ahead of our well-being and our understanding in the digital sciences area. So I mentioned these 6 areas as applied, downstream, hugely important public policy challenges. Every one of them is built on the base of basic science, so I don't want to be misunderstood as neglecting the basic sciences, which are completely fundamental. But I do want to emphasize that solutions to human problems require a new kind of knowledge partnership, combining the sciences, the engineering, and the public policy, and then enabling that package of knowledge to be effectively shared, understood, and democratically governed by the public. And we are in a completely, we're beyond the age where amateurism is going to succeed. Our climate crisis is pervasive. Our crisis of biodiversity loss is urgent. So we have no more time. We have to mobilize the best knowledge that we have and create pathways of actual change. And that requires new kinds of knowledge-based politics. So that is the basic idea that I want to share with you. Let me pause here and turn it back over to you, and to thank you for the chance to be with you.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. We are open to the question now. There are a lot of issues, subjects that are in this discussion. There are many areas like energy, climate change, biodiversity, health, education, ICT, but there are one more important question about the idea that you need to have a plan of action. So I know that many countries, many research foundations have some kinds of plan of action. So I suggest you to start with your plans and ask Professor Sachs about what the next step, what to do more than we are doing. To open the floor, please.
Schiebinger from Stanford University. You have exactly the right message. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, for instance, the oil lobby. So in the United States, the lobbies are extremely strong. And in your plan of bringing together the scientists, the engineers, and the policy people, how can we act with the lobbies functioning so strongly?
Great. Shall we take a couple questions and then I'll respond? Maybe that would be the best way.
Yes. Ingrid?
Thank you very much. I'm Ingrid Peterson from Sweden, and I have 3 questions. The first one is about science. In the environmental field, we have IPCC and IPBES. Can you reflect on whether we need to have some kind of scientific panel also for social justice? My second question is that you identified 6 areas where more knowledge is needed. But what kind of programs do you think I, as a funder, should invest in the next decade to have the most impact for sustainability? And my third question, and that's maybe the most tricky one, what can be done to bridge between the science community and the politicians? As if we are not acting together in partnership, very little will be done. Thank you.
More one question. Professor Sachs.
Great, thank you very much. And these questions are related. I have a theory of change which is inadequate, but it's at least my own approach to this, which is that the knowledge community is the unique repository of the deep understanding of the directions that society should take. And it's our responsibility to put forward concrete proposals and explanations to the public, as well as to the politicians, about what should be done, rather than waiting for the politicians to solve a problem that they cannot solve, or waiting for the public to somehow magically create what actually requires an extensive body of knowledge and information. So I believe that we have a possibility of making major change based on rigor, transparency, honesty, framed in an operational and in an action sense. And let me be clear, by this I do not mean that we announce how dangerous climate change is, though that's true. I'm talking about putting forward a pathway of reaching zero emissions by mid-century. That is a different path, a different task from giving a warning. It is giving a proposed solution. And I believe that by giving proposed solutions, we have a very effective way, not perfect, but a very effective way to counter the lobbies. Because the lobbies, of course, win on disinformation or confusion. But the public actually wants climate safety, for example. They want their children to grow up, we want our children to grow up in a safe world. The lobbies obfuscate. They say we don't know, we can't solve these problems, it's not so bad. But when the knowledge community comes forward and is very clear, not only is this the danger, but this is a path to avert the danger, this becomes quite compelling. Now, there is a difference between the IPCC and what I'm speaking about. Because the IPCC or IPBES is mainly about the first stage of this. What is the climatology? What are the risks? What are the different damages if we go to 1.5 degree or 2 degrees? And very limited messaging and very limited clarity on the pathways of solution. because IPCC, after all, is mainly a climatology group. It is not mainly an engineering group. And I do think there's a lot of confusion about the difference of science and engineering in the public. Scientists cannot solve these problems. Scientists can frame the problems, explain the problems, give the dynamics, but it is engineers to a very significant extent that are needed to actually solve the problems. They make the artificial systems that we live in to make our economies function within planetary constraints. So we don't have such bodies. We have a body on climate danger. We have a body on ecological danger, but we do not have a body on pathways of decarbonization. We do not have a global body on pathways of species survival and land use. We have the dangers, but not the solutions. So on the question of what to invest in, I would invest in pathways to sustainable development. In other words, what are the practical steps? But by practical, I mean science-based, engineering explicit, and public policy explicit paths to actually address the underlying challenge, such as decarbonization of the energy system. Now, this becomes much more political because it's actually not just what is the warning, but what to do, actually. And our multilateral processes are much better at the warning and at the goal, but very weak in general at what to do. And they're very weak by design because powerful governments like the United States don't want to be told what to do. Powerful industries don't want to be told what to do. But the truth is that we need to go beyond just the risks or the nice ideas or the aspirational goals. We need to go to the actual pathways. And I think if we made some pathway global projects like a pathway of decarbonization commission or a pathway of biological conservation that takes as given the upstream inputs from IPCC and IPBS, but says downstream, here is the technological, and policy frameworks that can move this to success, we would have a tremendous way to move forward. On the question of linking science and politics, I would give basically the same answer, which is to understand our politicians. In my job as an economist for 40 years, I've been dealing with politicians nonstop. First of all, they don't know any of the deep issues involved. It's not their job, it's not their training, it's not their responsibility from their point of view. Second, politicians do not have time to think. Once you assume office, you're running every day until you finish your politics. And there's no thinking time left over. And so it is unrealistic to expect our political class to come up with a deep decarbonization strategy. And politicians need to know from the knowledge community actually what to do. They don't need the warnings so much, although of course it's not bad to give them the warnings of the dire consequences of failing to act. They should hear that, but it's not sufficient to give them that. What they need to know is what to do, and we need to understand they do not know. They don't have the time. They cannot work this out. They cannot turn to their energy minister and get an adequate answer to that. And therefore, we live in a knowledge world that is not well designed to harness the knowledge right now. From the academic side, it's too academic. And from the political side, it's too divorced from practice. And so we need to be creating that value chain and saying to the politicians, you have to listen because you otherwise don't know. And it is true that they don't know. There are very few scientists in office that even have the beginnings of understanding. But there's nobody in office today in the world at a leadership level that is trained across these disciplines to have a deep understanding of the changes that are needed. And their cabinet ministers, by and large, are lawyers or diplomats, but they're local politicians who assume a 2 or 3 year portfolio. And that's not good enough also. The ministries are engaged in policy implementation. That's the job of most ministries, that there's a law that has been passed and their job is to implement. They are not generally academic departments. They are not generally planning organizations. They are implementing bodies. So I just emphasize all of this because this is my experience, that we are not getting the knowledge to bear where it needs to get, and it's not packaged in an operational action sense. But I would say to the first question also on the oil lobbies, California is, of course, one of our shining success stories, relatively speaking, because California has the benefit of not being overwhelmed by the oil lobbies on the one hand, vulnerable to climate change, secondly, and home to Stanford, Berkeley, Silicon Valley, so that the means to analyze and understand these issues are world-leading standard, and that's why California is leading the whole United States in putting forward practical solutions to this. We need, by the way, to take the California model to national scale. But I think the point that I'm emphasizing is let's invest in systematic pathways, not only in the analytics of the problem. And then finally, the idea that you mentioned of a global panel on social justice is a spectacular idea, a very Swedish idea, if I may say so, because there is a science to social justice. It happens to be a social democratic ethos and policy framework that involves a fiscal framework that enables government to provide universal access to key services in a particular way, so that your country in Sweden and other Nordic countries have the lowest inequality in the world. Most countries do not understand the Scandinavian or the Nordic model. They don't understand what makes it tick. They don't understand what government is doing that reduces the inequality, or what the social partners are doing, what the role of trade unions is, or national scale wage setting and so forth. The idea of a systematic understanding of how to reduce inequality within countries is a fantastic idea, because right now it's left to politics and the tabloids, but there is a tremendous scientific base, social science, that explains why it is that Sweden has a Gini coefficient below 0.3 and the US has a Gini coefficient above 0.4 and Brazil about at 0.5. And this is such a wonderful idea. I would encourage you to try to move it forward, and I would be happy to give any encouragement and help for that.
Thank you, Professor. There are more questions here.
Katharina Michaelova from the Swiss National Science Foundation. I have two questions. One is related to our choice of funding instruments. And one of the things we have been debating here is whether in order to achieve these objectives that you mentioned, it may be more or less important to, on the one hand side, encourage these collaborations that you mentioned, bridging between different partners from the different sides, or whether it is more relevant I don't know what the right balance would be, to orient research towards these topics, or towards a combination of these topics, or towards a more network thinking around these topics. Because usually, we can't do everything and capture everything in one instrument. The other question is with respect to the evaluation of the research. To what extent would you think that the economic, environmental, societal relevance should be in a way considered part of a broader notion of scientific excellence in itself when we evaluate scientific excellence? Thank you.
Another question, please.
Thank you. Thank you for addressing us. We are GRC, and the presentation you have made is very powerful. And I'm sure you have also reflected on this organization. So in simple terms, 1, 2, 3 action items, do you have any specific recommendations for us by way of action to take?
Please.
Clement Dockner, Austrian Science Fund. I have a question. Will we face primarily an engineered future? That, for example, if we take climate engineering, that it's too late to find other solutions than just pure engineering solutions for solving the key challenges.
Please.
Yeah, my name is Jorge Tesson from Argentina. Much of the causes for lack of change is put in the big industries and oil productions, but let's think on the other extreme, the consumers. How do you think that the consumers can change this balance between the power of oil producers and the actual use of oil or carbon fuels? And I would say that related to that, there is something that we don't really address in our agencies, is this social sciences related to global change, but related to not at the risk of catastrophes and disasters, but rather to economics and to consumption.
Professor Sachs, please.
Thank you for wonderful questions and observations. I think, first of all, we need a balance between funding and support for deep disciplinary knowledge and basic research and these applied challenges. Without the basic research, we would not even understand these applied challenges. But we can't leave the basic research without then addressing the implications of the findings. And basic research, we know from modern history, has been, to a very significant extent, following the logic of fundamental inquiry, and then realizing that opens up areas for technological application. So I don't think, I think our history of knowledge shows us that we really want to keep investing in basic science, in all of the basic sciences, and they're all at a very fruitful time right now. But we do need to understand that this applied solutions science is a different kind of field, and it is inherently a goal-based and collaborative exercise rather than an inquiry-based exercise. Inquiry is to understand an underlying phenomenon. The kinds of problems I'm talking about are to solve a problem. They are inherently more engineering in one sense. That is that they are aiming to apply knowledge to get an outcome. And but they're engineering both in the physical engineering sense and in the policy engineering sense. So I would recommend programs, for example, at a National Science Foundation that says we will support teams to produce plans for deep decarbonization of our energy system. And we will evaluate the proposals by ensuring that there's the adequate mix of expertise in the team, because such a team should include scientists, engineers from a few disciplines, and policy experts, and some social scientists on behavioral issues as well. But the goal of the project that would be funded is produce a plan for Switzerland to reach zero carbon emissions by mid-century. And that would be a competitive kind of bid. Or produce a plan for zero species loss over the next 30 years for the list of endangered species in the country. Make a team that includes the fundamental sciences, the ecology, the climatology, the applied conservation biology, the public policy, the anthropology, to give the right answer to that. But the way that the problem would be posed is don't come back with a new scientific finding, come with a pathway, which is a policy explicit and technology explicit and financial explicit, time linked description of how we're going to achieve a particular outcome that is stated in the first line of the policy proposal. How we're going to achieve decarbonization, or how we're going to reduce deaths from non-communicable diseases by 1/3 by 2030, or some other goal. That kind of funding would be really fantastic. And I don't think it's easy to find, actually, because with the Earth Institute, for example, most of our work was inventing projects and trying to convince donors to fund them, given that they were very unusual and they cut across 5 or 6 disciplines, and they weren't clearly oriented towards a disciplinary scientific challenge, but towards a public policy objective. But I would really love to see much more of that. I think it's absolutely, absolutely vital. And in terms of the action items, I do think a good guide for the GRC is precisely the global agreements of Agenda 2030 and the Paris Climate Agreement. After all, every one of your governments has signed them. They are time-bound, explicit objectives. They all have a scientific underpinning, a technology need, a policy framework, and so they lend themselves to this kind of action agenda. And I would say that if the Global Research Council says we are promoting collaborative research activities to identify pathways to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, this would be a remarkable contribution, and it would mobilize a tremendous amount of effort in the right direction. Even the proposal writing will make breakthroughs, of course. In this, colleagues will meet each other that have never met each other before. Now, are we in engineering solutions? Absolutely. We are right now 7.7 billion people on the planet. Our normal species expectation for species of our mammals of our biomass might be 50 million. But we have reached 7.7 billion. There is no way that the world can operate without highly engineered solutions. The world today clears several $1 trillion of payments every day. The world clears terabytes of knowledge at frightening speed and frequency. The world manages billions of travelers. The world has to get food and clean water to 7.7 billion people every single day. The world has to get electricity to 7.7 billion people every day. These are engineered systems that have to operate effectively, reliably, efficiently, and at a global scale. And they don't. First, they leave a lot of people out right now. So there are at least 1.5 billion people in extreme duress. Second, they are not sustainable in the way that they operate. And third, they're not fair because 2 billion people live a very good life and the other 5.5 billion people struggle, of which the bottom 1.5 billion people barely survive. So yes, we need engineering, but engineering that is sustainable and just. But there's no way to do this in a low-tech way, because a low-tech way supported a population of 500 million people, not a population 15 times as large, which we have today. So we're trapped. We're trapped the same way that the hunter-gatherers got trapped in agriculture because the population increased and there was no going back from the hard labor of agriculture. We are trapped in engineering now, and we just have to make our engineered systems work adequately. When it comes to consumption, the problem is the following. The problem is not that we're flying too many planes or driving too much. The problem is that the technologies that we use to do that are not the ones we need now. I don't think we're using too much electricity, for example, although, of course, efficiency would be desirable. But we want the electricity to be produced with zero carbon. And so we need to look at the fundamental needs. Of course, there's a lot of frivolous consumption as well, especially by the very rich, because the world does not need 400-foot yachts and private planes and fifth mansions and so on. And we should be taking more care of the world, that we're not letting conspicuous consumption simultaneously destroy the planet. But the real issue is to make sure that the consumption that we have is environmentally manageable and socially just. And that is a design problem to a large extent. And fortunately, from everything I know as an economist, we have the technologies, we have the renewable energy, we have the land that can provide for 7.7 billion people, probably not for 12 billion, by the way, but maybe for up to 9 billion. But we need a new suite of technologies in order to be able to enable the world to live both well and sustainably, and also to live equitably. That is a transformational problem.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for this interesting speech. And I am sure it will inspire us to do more and to share our experience related to SDG and global challenge. Thank you very much.
Thanks for allowing me to be with you.